Hi everyone, this is Trisha Thompson from Gluten Free Watchdog. This video is intended to accompany the handout on oats. This handout was provided to dietitians at a breakfast sponsored by dietitians in gluten intolerance diseases that was held during the Food and Nutrition Conference and Expo in Boston. This is an annual meeting of dietitians. At this breakfast, Seton Smith from Gluten Free Harvest was the featured speaker. We also invited a supplier of mechanically and optically sorted oats to speak. They declined, so it fell on my shoulders to present information on mechanically and optically sorted oats. You should know, and those of you who follow Gluten Free Watchdog do know, that I am a big supporter of the use of purity protocol oats by people with gluten-related disorders. I am not a big fan of the use of mechanically and optically sorted oats. However, the information in the handout, which you have access to as well, not just the dietitians at the breakfast, there's a PDF has been posted at Gluten Free Watchdog. The information in the handout is intended to be factual and hopefully will be presented in an unbiased fashion so that you can make up your own mind. So do make sure that you have printed out a copy of this handout, and I'm going to briefly run through some of the information, highlight some of the more important points. If I'm looking off to the side, that's because I'm actually looking at the handout. So looking first at the section on definitions, I've included some very basic definitions here on the various categories of oats that are important to folks on gluten-free diets. It's important to stress that the designation of oats as gluten-free or certified gluten-free simply means that that product should test below 20 parts per million of gluten. It does not, however, provide any information on whether the oats themselves are purity protocol oats or mechanically or optically sorted oats. Just so we're on the same page as I'm going through this information, when I refer to mechanically or optically sorted oats, I am talking about traditionally grown oats that undergo a sorting process at the mill to remove gluten-containing grain based on a variety of grain properties such as size and color. So move down now to the section on why oats are an issue. One of the reasons that some of us have concerns about whether regular oats can be sorted to be completely or almost completely gluten-free, in other words, completely remove wheat, barley, and rye, is due to their level of contamination. Now, the table in this handout isn't clear, but you can easily access it online at the link provided in this section. This is a table from a study that I did in 2004, way back when. Before we had purity protocol oats, these were regular oats, not labeled gluten-free, and I looked at 4 different lots from 3 brands. The brands were Quaker, Country Choice, and McCann's. And the bottom line is that we found gluten levels ranging from less than 3 parts per million to over 1,800 parts per million. So gluten levels varied greatly within a brand of oats depending upon the lot that was being tested and also between the different brands of oats. So the New England Journal of Medicine study was on gluten contamination levels in regular oats. What are we seeing in oats that are labeled gluten-free? What type of contamination are we seeing? Over the past 5 years at Gluten Free Watchdog, we have tested 35 different oat products with oats as either the first ingredient or the second ingredient. If you look down at the bulleted list, you will see that 30 out of the 35 products tested below 20 parts per million of gluten. but 5 of the products, or 14%, tested at or above 20 parts per million gluten. When we shared these results with manufacturers, which we always share results when products are at or above 20 parts per million, and we talked to them about where they were sourcing their oats, none of these manufacturers were using purity protocol oats at the time that their products were tested. Another important point here is that based on all the testing that we've done at Gluten Free Watchdog, oat products labeled gluten-free appear to be at a higher risk of gluten contamination as compared to labeled gluten-free foods as a whole. Approximately 5% of all foods tested through Gluten Free Watchdog that are labeled gluten-free are testing at or above 20 parts per million. And that level has held constant throughout the now close to 6 years that we've been testing labeled gluten-free foods. And as I just said, 14% of oats labeled gluten-free are testing at or above 20 parts per million gluten. So now moving down to the section that's titled Testing Protocols followed by Millers of Mechanically Sorted Oats. I want to briefly run through this. Testing protocols have been shared with me by Quaker and General Mills to a fairly large extent, to a lesser extent Lacrosse Milling, and to an even lesser extent grain millers. But I have provided what they have said to me or written to me in email correspondence in this handout. Much more extensive information is provided on the Gluten Free Watchdog website under the News tab. So if you just go there, search on Quaker or search on General Mills, the extensive information will come up. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about the testing protocols followed by these manufacturers, please read those articles in full. Looking first at Quaker gluten-free oatmeal, their finished product testing is as follows, and this was confirmed in July of 2016. They test 16 pouches or tubes during a production run. That's approximately 1 pouch or tube every half hour. They take a 40-gram sample from each pouch or tube and they homogenize that sample, meaning that they thoroughly grind it to hopefully evenly distribute any gluten contamination within that 40-gram sample. They then take 2 extractions from the hopefully homogenized sample, and those are the extractions that are actually tested. If any single extraction from any of the 16 pouches or tubes is above 12 parts per million, the entire lot is discarded. So in other words, Quaker is testing a total of 32 individual extractions, 2 from each 40-gram sample from every lot of oats. I should say every lot, their oatmeal. If any one extraction tests above 12 parts per million, the entire lot is thrown away. Sorry about that. So now moving down to gluten-free Cheerios. Their finished product testing protocol is as follows and was confirmed August of 2016. General Mills determines gluten-free status of a lot of oats, not a lot of oats, but a lot of oats. And they define a lot as a 24-hour production cycle. To arrive at a lot mean, the following protocol is followed. 12 to 18 boxes of cereal are pulled during a production cycle. The contents of each of these individual boxes are ground to hopefully, again, homogenize, evenly distribute any gluten contamination within that individual box. A subsample of the ground product from each box is taken, and these subsamples are composited, meaning that they are combined, and they are then rehomogenized to hopefully evenly distribute all of the gluten in any of these subsamples. And then a minimum of 12 extractions are taken from this combined ground sample. In other words, General Mills is testing 12 extractions per lot from a combined sample that includes subsamples from 12 to 18 different boxes of cereal. The results from these 12 extractions are then averaged to arrive at a lot mean. In August of 2015, General Mills advised me that all lots of yellow box Cheerios were testing below 15 parts per million. Looking down at grain millers, I have limited information on their final testing protocol. The only thing that I do know and that they have confirmed is that they're testing one extraction for every 2,000 pounds of oats. That's their final product testing. Lacrosse Milling also provided me with some information. They test their oats on a per pallet basis. There are 40,000 pounds of oats per pallet. They test the first bag, the middle bag, and the last bag in the pallet. If any result comes back over 10 parts per million gluten, the pallet is rejected. One other point that I think is important to make before moving on is that General Mills and Quaker are sorting their own oats that they are using in their own branded products. They are not, at this time at least, selling oats to other manufacturers of gluten-free foods. Grain millers and Lacrosse Milling supply sorted oats to gluten-free manufacturers. And in the case of grain millers, this appears to have been happening since 2012. So in other words, sorted oats have been in the food supply, gluten-free food supply, for a few years. The last issue I want to touch on are recommendations for testing from our biofarm. So look down now at the heading, Our Biofarm Instructions for Testing Oat Samples. Testing for gluten contamination in oats is tricky because wheat, barley, and rye kernels are not evenly distributed between an entire lot of oats. Instead, that contamination is going to be fairly spotty. And as a result, our biofarm has changed their recommendation for testing oat samples. And you can read through what I've written here at your leisure, but the main takeaway points are that they are now recommending that a larger sample size be pulled and homogenized. It used to be 5 grams were the recommended amount to be homogenized. They're now recommending 200 grams. And then the actual extraction that they're testing for gluten contamination has increased from 0.25 grams to 1 gram. So these recommendations are intended to provide a greater likelihood that any gluten contamination within that sample will be captured in the sample test. In this handout, I've also included some information on a study that was recently published in the peer-reviewed journal by Quaker PepsiCo scientists. I highly recommend that you try to read the actual article in full. I have summarized it here in the handout. It provides important information not only on testing oats for gluten, but also gluten testing in general. The bottom line is really that final product testing must be extensive for oats, or manufacturers really run the risk of missing gluten contamination. So that's all I'm going to touch on as far as this handout. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send them in via the comment section. That helps other people see the questions that are being asked and also prevents me from answering the same question over and over again. But I'm happy to answer any questions. And please remember that this handout was provided to dietitians. It was never meant to be a standalone document, and it went along with the presentation from Seton Smith from Gluten Free Harvest about Purity Protocol Oats. Thank you so much.